You ready? Let's dig in the raw mechanics of religious zealotry and how it drags people into perpetual moral violence, self-hatred, and spiritual tyranny. Let me tell you a truth: zealotry doesn't start with power. It begins with fear, fear of uncertainty, fear of being wrong, fear of your own emptiness. When a person is desperate for stability, for someone else to define right and wrong, a religion offering absolute clarity becomes seductive. You surrender your inner compass in exchange for an external grid that says, do this, don't do that, my certainty is your rule. You're not dealing with a mild believer. A religious zealot internalizes this grid as the only reality. Doubt becomes heresy. Questions are threats, not exploration. That's the first crack. You stop thinking your own thoughts. You hand over your conscience. From psychology, we see fanaticism as identity fused with sacred values. When your sense of self is bound to God's will or divine purity, any deviation feels existential. You don't just fail, you betray. Studies show that dogmatic, rigid beliefs intensify when you feel your views are opposed by the majority. In that tension, your mind hardens. You defend not just a belief but your identity. Opposition becomes proof you are persecuted for righteous truth. Now imagine doing that in a social bubble where the loudest voices echo your fears, amplify your guilt, and punish nuance. You're cornered into extremes to prove you belong. Let's pull in historical context. The original zealots, Jewish militant groups under Roman occupation, were people who insisted that God's law overrides empire. They used violence to purify the community and root out apostasy. Their name lives on because their method was lethal, their conviction absolute. You see the pattern: when authority, religion, and self-righteous rage fuse, dissenters become enemies, and compromise is betrayal. Modern zealotry mimics that. The target shifts, but the machinery remains the same. Here's a fact that rips open complacency: religious fanatics often care less about suffering of themselves or others than about their mission. They see pain as collateral, acceptable, even necessary. A person tortured, silenced, shamed, if it serves a higher cause, is rationalized away. That allowed in history the Inquisitions, witch hunts, crusades, and today the silent wars against apostates, ex-believers, and minorities. Once your moral hierarchy elevates purpose over empathy, cruelty becomes invisible, clean, righteous. Let's zoom in on how this operates in individual minds. The zealot needs us vs them. Inside the group you're safe, outside the group, you're dangerous. So self-censoring begins. You learn to see sin everywhere, in others' words, in culture, in neutral conversation. You become a moral detector. If someone questions doctrine, you see threat. If someone laughs at a taboo, you see blasphemy. And your anxiety spikes: is my faith strong enough? Am I pure enough? That pressure destroys mental space for doubt, nuance, growth. Over time, uncertainty becomes unbearable. You dig in harder. And now the most brutal turn: the zealot's rebellion against ambivalence becomes a revolt against self. You partly hate yourself for not being perfect. You are always chasing an ideal you never reach. You measure yourself against ghost standards of holiness. Every thought, every slip, internalized condemnation echoes: you are failing. That internal war becomes your everyday torment. A sharp gear shift: religious institutions accelerate this. They define stricter codes, label deviation as spiritual disease, threat, impurity. They recruit guilt, shame, fear as tools. They promise redemption or acceptance only if you obey rigid formulas. Disobedience is punished socially, spiritually, emotionally. They allow no halfway. You are either in alignment or condemned. So they tighten the grip. More rules. More judgment. More policing of the soul. Anyone willing to question is branded as enemy, liberal, apostate. Now let me ask you, if someone offers you a map that says you can never lose, but demands you surrender your autonomy, would you take it? Many do, because the price seems small at first: security, belonging, purpose. But that is the trap: the deeper you commit, the more you need to defend it, and the more you lose control. The idea, commit sin, get punished. Sounds simple, but religious systems don't just casually punish, they build cosmic machinery around the claim that you are under constant threat of direct divine injury, and you're always one step away from it. First, the scriptures across traditions are packed with stories where God doesn't wait. He floods, he drowns, he burns cities, destroys innocent populations, all because the people sinned. That isn't metaphor for many believers, that is literal precedent. A storm, a plague, famine, these are framed as divine responses to collective or individual moral failure. That narrative trains adherents to see disaster as moral correction. Second, hell and eternal torment aren't decorative appendices to theology, they are central coercive tools. Many religious systems teach degrees of punishment, some worse than others depending on how badly you deviated, how influential your sin was, how well you understood the truth. You're held accountable not just for actions but for the state of your heart. That awareness stokes fear, guilt, paranoia. Even when you do better, you're terrified of unseen failure. You're always one misstep. The concept of degrees in hell is discussed in Christian theology. Third, some doctrines push the idea of temporal punishment. You suffer now as a direct effect of sin even if ultimate forgiveness is possible. Disease, poverty, misfortune, some preachers will tell you, this is God punishing you or your ancestors. That turns every setback into spiritual indictment. You internalize every misfortune as proof you're morally failing. Believers begin to see their life as a ledger, sin equals consequence, and you don't escape until full atonement. Fourth, in extreme systems, there's no real escape. Some traditions define unpardonable sins, acts so heinous that divine justice can never forgive. That doctrine is terrorizing. You can't undo certain sins, so any slip feels like walking the edge of an inescapable abyss. That breeds fanaticism as people claw desperately to prove they're in the safe zone. Fifth, this divine punishment schema gets tangled with power. Religious authorities often claim exclusive insight into God's will, so they claim the right to declare who is being punished, who is forgiven, who is outside grace. Leaders say, I see your sin. I see God's anger. That lets them enforce conformity. They reinterpret disasters, tragedies, social problems as evidence of a group's moral failing, and they demand repentance or cleansing from members. They use divine punishment as validation for their control. Sixth, some claim suffering isn't just retributive but medicinal. God punishes to correct, to heal your soul. The doctrine sounds kind until you see it in practice. You stay in suffering, job loss, depression, abuse, and are told it's spiritual treatment, a trial to sanctify you. That normalizes abuse. You're passive. You don't push back, because inside your mind, pain becomes divine discipline. The result, abuse, trauma, control disguised as holiness. Finally, believers who've lived under these doctrines often testify to crises. They report years of mental torment, interpreting every bad break as moral failure, living in shame, believing that only God's wrath is waiting. Many leave religion precisely because this punitive structure crushed their soul. You live inside a machine of spiritual coercion. The machinery isn't just doctrine, it's emotional, mental, relational. It's made to dismantle your psyche from the inside. This is the battlefield of religious trauma, where your own mind becomes a battleground. You won't often hear this. Trauma in religion doesn't need fists or chains. It's built via psychological domination, subtle, relentless pressure that shapes your inner world. You are taught that any emotion other than devotion is suspect. You are told your mind, your instincts, your desires are traps, temptations. Over time you learn not to trust yourself. You outsource your moral sense to an institution. That's spiritual abuse, the power move behind so many broken lives. The victims I talk to, former believers, ex-fundamentalists, they speak of constant internal fog. Decisions, even everyday ones, feel like walking through quicksand. You learn that doubt is sin, that your voice is dangerous. Then one day you wake up and you don't know who you are without the doctrine. That's erosion of identity. That's religious trauma syndrome in motion. Symptoms don't whisper. They scream depression, anxiety, emotional numbness, rage. Sometimes your memories fracture. You compartmentalize your suffering because remembering is too painful. You replay the worst sermons, the abuse, the shame, over and over. You're stuck in loops. I'm dirty, I'm broken, I'm hopeless. You try to pray your way out. It doesn't work. When religious doctrine enforces silence, the trauma festers. The doctrine says, don't speak, don't question, don't judge authority. That forbids processing. You carry secrets, shame, guilt, and your soul shrinks around it. You collapse inward. Then there's betrayal by those you trusted most, spiritual leaders, parents, community. You put faith in them to protect your soul. Instead, they judge it, punish it, exploit it. That betrayal doesn't just wound belief, it attacks your capacity to trust anything ever again. That betrayal trauma is brutal. You feel abandoned by your God and by your people at the same time. That's double ruin. Especially for survivors of clergy abuse. You'll find countless accounts where pastors, priests, spiritual mentors exploit emotional authority. They identify vulnerabilities, doubt, insecurity, shame, and they push, coerce, manipulate. Some go further: sexual abuse, emotional exploitation, scapegoating. Victims report it destroys their relationship with faith itself. They report guilt layered over the abuse. I sinned by not resisting better. That guilt chains them longer than the abuse itself. Sexual boundary violations in religious settings are especially toxic, because the abuser claims divine sanction. You're taught that your body is holy, that your purity matters. Then your body becomes the site of abuse. The cognitive dissonance shreds your sense of safety. You can't escape your own skin. Afterward, you hear echoes: you brought this on yourself. The doctrine is weaponized again, not just over your sins, now over your wounds. When institutional power protects the abuser, it layers institutional betrayal on top. The institution defends reputation, buries accusations, shames whistleblowers, forces silence. You see it over and over: cover-ups, transfers, denials. You learn faith institutions protect power, not people. That destroys more than belief, it fractures your moral lens. Inside the trauma, your brain reorganizes. You shut down, you disassociate during worship or prayer. You build walls between your spiritual self and your emotional self. Part of you remains in devotion, the other part, in rage or fear or numbness. You live split. You carry two selves that barely speak. Religious trauma often mirrors complex PTSD. There's captivity, no bars, but no safe exit. Psychological domination, the authority voice overshadows your inner voice. Erosion of personality, slow disappearance of your desires, your rebellion, your curiosity. When you exit, you don't just lose a belief system, you lose your bearings. You're exiled inside your own mind. Ask yourself, how many former believers wake up and discover their moral sense, integrity, emotional health, relational capacity were never allowed to develop? They grew inside constraints. Their mind was shaped, pruned, silenced. Then the cage opens, and their wings don't know how to fly. Religious institutions are not abstract moral actors, they're bureaucracies with agendas, assets, reputations to protect, enemies to suppress. When scandal or deviance surfaces, their reflex is containment, not accountability. That containment often means violence, physical, sexual, emotional, and structural repression. Take the persistence of child sexual abuse within religious systems. There is overwhelming evidence that clergy across denominations have perpetrated abuse for decades, and that institutional leadership systematically covered it up. They shuffled abusers to other parishes, silenced victims, destroyed records. The priority: protect the institution. In one major church, thousands of allegations were filed over decades, with hundreds of priests implicated, yet internal hierarchies delayed or blocked investigations. Many survivors came forward decades later, forced out by trauma and secrecy. That's institutional violence in its purest form. Physical abuse also surfaces in religious boarding schools, orphanages run by religious orders, convent schools, institutional homes. Beating, corporal punishment, forced labor, emotional humiliation, all justified under discipline, spiritual formation, or obedience. In some cases, communities testify that children were locked away, starved, punished for minor perceived infractions, cut off from external contact. These institutions operate under religious cover, which grants them moral immunity in the eyes of many, disciplined by God masks brutality. Then there's cultural erasure and spiritual colonization. Religion has often been a tool for colonial power to suppress native belief systems, demonize indigenous rituals, force convert, rewrite local morals. Under that crusade, entire community spiritual systems were dismantled, symbols destroyed, priests replaced, language of worship reprogrammed, all under the umbrella of saving souls. That's violence not just of body, but of collective memory. Orthodox institutions often police internal dissent mercilessly. Heretics, reformers, internal critics are treated as enemies. Historically, inquisitions, forced confessions, torture, execution were state religion tools to preserve conformity. In modern systems, the violence is subtler: excommunication, shunning, social ostracism, defamation campaigns, threats of spiritual or communal retaliation. The target becomes existential: destroy the critic to deter others. In many cases, institutions weaponize spiritual authority to demand secrecy. They teach followers, do not question your superiors, confess your doubts to the church, not publicly. Criticism is sin. That's gaslighting on a grand scale. You question, you're the sinner. You speak out, you're punished. This culture protects abusers. Victims who try to expose wrongdoing are branded as rebels, traitors, or doubters. They're silenced, isolated, intimidated. The machinery also leveraged legal and financial power. Institutions draw on legal teams, influence over local courts, political connections, and vast resources. They fight lawsuits, bury evidence, intimidate witnesses. Victims often run out of resources long before institutions do. This asymmetry ensures many never reach justice. Consider a notorious order whose founder abused dozens of minors over decades. He ran at the system of power, promotions, secrets, inner circles that masked crimes. Only decades later, internal commissions, external pressure, survivors' testimonies forced acknowledgement. But even then, leadership maintained control over what was released, when, to whom. Abuse was allowed to metastasize because the institutional structure was built to protect itself first, truth second. Religious institutions also manipulate narratives. They frame victims as broken, sinful, unstable, decadent. Sometimes they cast their own whistleblowers as spiritually compromised. They insist that publicizing sin damaged the faith of the many, suppressing victims in the name of the greater good. That is violence wrapped in moral rhetoric. In extreme cases, institutions regulate sexuality, gender, bodily autonomy through legal enforcement, laws against abortion, homosexuality, apostasy. They collaborate with or become the state. The violence is state-sanctioned: fines, jail, corporal punishment, even death for acts labeled religious sin. The institution isn't just spiritual authority, it is judicial authority. The flip side, religious institutions erect walls around themselves. They oppose freedom of press, block transparency, regulate internal oversight. Internal commissions are often staffed by insiders. Policies change minimally. Public apologies come after decades of pressure. Structural cultures remain intact even after scandal. When damage surfaces, the instinct is damage control, deny, minimize, scapegoat, relocate offenders, seal archives, silence survivors. That's the central play. The faith institution fights for its reputation as though that reputation is sacred. The institution becomes priority over justice, over healing. Religious institutions with global reach have shown the same patterns across continents: abuse, cover-ups, secrecy, hierarchical suppression. The pattern is structural, not incidental. That means the violence is built into the architecture of religious power, not outside of it. The institution isn't failing, it's fulfilling design. You've seen how doctrine and institutions wield pain. Now let's expose how suffering is marketed as virtue, how martyrdom becomes a currency, and how spiritual elites use your agony for control and status. Suffering sells. In many religious systems, the message is, the more you suffer, the purer you are. The more pain you endure, fasting, isolation, bodily hardship, persecution, the closer to divine you become. That's not mysticism, it's a system of merit built on injury. You're told, your scars prove your faith. That creates a hierarchy of pain. Who can prove they hurt more becomes spiritually superior. Communities begin ranking sacrifices, giving up comforts, enduring sickness, ostracism. Martyrs are elevated, commemorated, venerated, not always because they spoke truth, but because they suffered loudest. In that economy, dissenters, critics, emotionally honest survivors are sidelined. They didn't pay enough in agony to qualify. Watch how the language shifts. Cross you must carry, blessed persecution, glory through suffering. You join that language and it becomes your identity. You don't suffer less, you are suspicious of your own well-being. You see suffering as evidence you're doing something right. Not arbitrary pain, but spiritual validation. Then the elite twist it further. Leaders claim they see God's finger in your suffering. They interpret your illness, your losses, your betrayals as divine test or purging. God is refining you, they say. Now the suffering is no longer random, it's assigned, personalized, meaningful, and thus obedient. You don't rebel against pain because you believe it's holy. Some systems push martyrdom as a deliberate goal. You're taught to crave persecution. If you receive none, you provoke it, speak a harsh word, provoke scandal. For many extremist ideologies, performing an act that gets you arrested or attacked becomes proof you're righteous. That's recruitment strategy disguised as spiritual calling. Look at political movements that frame dying in a cause as spiritual. Suicide bombers, jihadis, groups labeling their dead as shaheeds, they weaponize martyr narratives. Martyrdom becomes justification for violence, not just suffering. The individual's death becomes propaganda. The system converts human loss into myth. That's exploitation of suffering at its highest degree. Inside conventional religion too, martyr stories are curated. The suffering of saints, the persecuted, the oppressed, all become communal law. Those stories justify present suffering. Look how they suffered, you must endure too. The past becomes a template for present oppression. You don't escape because your suffering is part of a legacy. Leaders selectively spotlight the suffering that suits their agenda. You hear tales of persecution that justify political positioning, cultural wars, identity struggles. They silence suffering counter-narratives that don't support their control. Only certain pains get the spotlight. Not the domestic abuse, the emotional wounds, the institutional betrayals. Those come disguised or denied. Suffering becomes a tool of inclusion and exclusion. If yours matches the canonical template, you're embraced. If it doesn't, you're outside. Survivors of spiritual abuse, emotional breakdowns, they don't fit the martyr mold. They are seen as weak, unstable, unworthy. Their stories are inconvenient. So suffering is filtered, only the glorious sort is acceptable. And then the pinnacle, your own suffering is leveraged to extract more from you. Offer your trials, present your pain, sacrifice more. You give financially, you endure more grief, you give your time, your body, your silence. You're bleeding into the system and they smear it on altar cloths as signs of loyalty. Your pain becomes capital. It is mined, packaged, distributed. You are not just suffering for God, you are suffering for the system. The system profits, social influence, control, legitimacy, loyalty. The more you suffer, the more indebted you become to the institution. That's the dark economics of suffering in religion. That's how advancement is sold through agony. You have seen the engine of zealotry, punishment, institutional violence, and the perversion of suffering. Now you see the fallout, the collision, the wreckage, and how survivors revolt. People break free, institutions crack under pressure, dark corners are forced into daylight, and faith transforms or collapses. First, you confront faith deconstruction. In evangelical Christianity and other religions, many believers begin to dismantle their inherited belief system. Deconstruction is more than doubt, it's an excavation. You question foundational doctrines, authority claims, dogma you never chose. People walk away from rigid belief systems, rewrite theology in their own image, or abandon belief altogether. The movement is significant, it's not fringe. It's a reaction to disillusionment, to betrayal, to abuse. The term deconstruction has become popular among those rethinking their faith identity. Then you have the media and public exposure. Documentaries, investigative journalism, podcasts, all exposing abuse, cover-ups, hypocrisy. Films like Mea Maxima Culpa, Silence in the House of God show how institutions hid clerical abuse while silencing victims. Twist of Faith portrays one man's long struggle to confront institutional silence about sexual abuse. Holy Watergate examines how religious leadership relocated offending clergy and suppressed accountability. In Poland, Tell No One went viral, exposing how the Polish Catholic Church concealed child abuse for decades. And recently, documentaries like Nuns vs. the Vatican bring long-ignored stories of sexual misconduct by church leadership to audiences that had no exposure before. These exposures force institutions to respond or pretend to. Investigations, internal commissions, apologies, settlements. But many are cosmetic. The structures remain. Survivors often find the institutions still protect abusers, minimize harm, control the narrative. That ongoing conflict, survivors pushing, institutions resisting, is part of the war. Then there is exodus, large numbers of people leaving faith communities or leaving organized religion. Some become atheist or agnostic. Others redesign spirituality on their own terms. Many who exit do so because the cost of staying, emotional, psychological, moral, is unbearable. Their stories are not quiet retreats, they're loud revolts. They create podcasts, write blogs, produce videos, speak publicly. They don't vanish, they redirect the conversation. One side effect, the faith marketplace shifts. Alternative spiritualities, gnomes, progressive religions, deconstructed belief systems gain audience. The old institutions begin losing ground. Their authority wanes, membership declines, their gatekeeping power erodes. In certain circles, being a former insider gives you credibility, you are a witness, a whistleblower. Another layer, survivors create support networks. Online forums, deconstruction communities, therapy groups, memoirs. These spaces validate trauma, normalize recovery, provide language. They push against shame, helping people reconnect to emotional truth, moral integrity, identity, autonomy. These networks turn isolation into solidarity. Public pressure grows. Media, civil society, legal systems begin holding religious institutions accountable. Scandals provoke lawsuits, criminal charges, demands for transparency. In recent years, Christian nationalism, abusive fundamentalist movements, and the political overlap with extreme religion have drawn scrutiny. Some new documentaries focus precisely on the intersection of religion and political power, exposing how religion becomes a justification for violence and control in the public sphere. All this means the religious landscape is shifting. Belief is no longer captive to institutions. Authority claims are questioned. Hidden abuses get forced into daylight. New forms of spiritual identity emerge that resist the old machinery. And now, to you watching this, you are part of that shift. Your attention matters. Your questions matter. Your willingness to see the darkness forces the system to reckon. Thank you for staying until the end.